On this fifth episode of the Benson family murders, we continue to dig into the investigation after a car bomb killed Margaret Benson, her youngest son Scott, and severely injured her daughter Carol Lynn. At the conclusion of the last episode, we learned police were working with only two main theories of who might have committed these murders: a drug dealer that Scott had reportedly scammed out of $200,000, or Margaret's own son, Stephen Benson. However, today we're going to discuss a situation that came to light and catapulted a new suspect to the top of that list. In addition, we're going to find out what kinds of evidence forensics experts were able to identify. Will this be a case built solely on circumstantial evidence, or will physical evidence help police narrow the investigation to a single suspect? Join us to find out on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes and bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and a former firefighter.
And I'm Batman.
And the background noise is our dog, who will not lay down and shut up. A quick reminder that sources will be in the show notes. Please refer back to episode 1 for some important disclaimers related to this case. And as always, we welcome your feedback at crimetoburn@gmail.com. And you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Please consider leaving us a positive review on this episode on whichever platform you use to listen and on every episode you listen to. And feel free to tell us how much the dog is annoying you, because he's annoying me too. All right, so a very quick overview of where we are in the case. We know the Benson's car blows up with Margaret Benson, Scott Benson, and Carol Lynn Benson Kendall inside. Margaret and Scott are killed, but Carol Lynn survives, and Stephen Benson was not in the car, having supposedly forgotten a tape measure inside that he was going back to retrieve when the bomb exploded. Last week we found out that Carol Lynn made two conflicting statements immediately after the bombing. In one statement, she accused her own brother Stephen of being involved, and that was the one she made to EMS in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And in another statement to the family's maid, she said that Kim Beagle's brothers had to have been at fault. We also found out that Carol Lynn was actually Scott's birth mother, and we found out that investigators initially seemed interested in the theory that Scott's checkered past could have possibly made him a target of some nefarious characters, but that they seemed to quickly dismiss this possibility as a better suspect seemed to emerge. And that suspect was none other than Stephen Benson. He had motive, his mother's money, opportunity. He was the last one to drive the Suburban. And thanks to his absolutely absurd admission that he liked to build pipe bombs as a kid, police were pretty sure that he had means. But hearsay is not admissible, so police needed to confirm that what Stephen had allegedly admitted to at his mother and brother's funeral was true, and that he had apparently fostered a bomb-making hobby as a child. So investigators headed up to Pennsylvania to explore Stephen's past and find out if anyone could corroborate these assertions that Stephen had built pipe bombs in the past. And on July 23rd, they hit pay dirt. Or did they? You be the judge.
I will.
Okay. So investigators came across a man named Tom Schelling, and he was a former classmate of Stephen's. And he had actually been employed by the family in 1982 to do some roof repairs on one of their Lancaster properties. Tom told investigators that while he was on the roof working on it, he saw Stephen Benson walk out of the house in the direction of the tennis courts on the property, carrying 3 copper pipes with wires coming out of them. Stephen disappeared from view, and suddenly Schelling reported that he heard 3 loud explosions that he described as sounding like M80s going off. He was concerned, so he scrambles down from the roof, heads off in the direction that he'd seen Stephen Benson heading, and he encounters Stephen Benson walking back towards him, holding a black box that he said looked similar to maybe a garage door opener, but it had 2 buttons on it, one red and one white, and Stephen was laughing as he passed the very confused and befuddled Schelling. Schelling said he didn't see any damage anywhere, And so he couldn't say for sure that the devices Stephen had been carrying were bombs, if the device was a remote control, the little black box thing, or if the noise he'd heard was whatever Stephen had been carrying, or if Stephen was responsible for the noise. He hadn't asked Stephen what the noise was, and Stephen hadn't given him an explanation. But for police, this was enough, and they felt that what they had was proof that Stephen liked to build and blow up bombs. Now note that none of Stephen's other friends reported any knowledge of Stephen building bombs. They all recounted incidents of Stephen blowing up cherry bombs, little firecrackers, but none of them recalled pipe bombs. The closest thing anyone else corroborated was that it's possible they might remember Stephen having used a remote switch and a battery to ignite a cherry bomb at some point, but that was like as close as it got. So it's a good thing they had Schilling's totally circumstantial, non-specific, non-provable memory of some copper tubes that may or may not have been bombs, that may or may not have been blown up near some tennis courts that sustained zero visible damage from the possible but not definite explosions that Stephen may or may not have triggered using a black box that could have been literally anything. Totally a smoking gun or an exploding lotus. I'm not sure. But despite my personal misgivings about this quote-unquote recollection, police were confident that they now had proven Stephen had means to go along with the motive and opportunity that they already knew he had, and he was their prime suspect. I feel like if someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, bro, is this friend of yours prone to road rage? We're investigating them for a road rage incident." And I go, "Oh yeah, like 4 years ago I saw him drive past me, and after they were out of sight I heard a horn. So yeah, they probably have road rage." Like, I feel like that's like the level of reliability we're working with here.
There's a lot of may or may not going on.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like it could be reliable at all.
How old was he? Like,
he was the same age. He had gone to high school with Stephen, so he was around the same age as Stephen.
No, but like he was in high school when he said that happened.
No, this happened in '82, so it would have been 3 years before the bombing.
Oh.
And the other thing that doesn't help the story is that Schilling was an ex-con. And I'm not saying that an ex-con is always going to be lying, but they do tend to make juries a little suspicious of their motives and whether or not they're telling the truth. This puts Stephen even higher up on investigators' lists of possible suspects. But not to be outdone on the dance floor, Wayne Kerr did not leave his friend alone in the spotlight of police scrutiny. Now remember, Wayne Kerr was the Benson's lawyer.
Right.
Like a good friend and lawyer, Kerr threw the investigators for a bit of a loop by catapulting himself into the top tier of their suspect list, joining Stephen. So how did the Benson family attorney end up a suspect himself? Well, let's find out, shall we? After police initially questioned Kerr and Benson, obviously, on the day of the explosions, the next day, they stopped cooperating with police completely. On July 24th, so a couple weeks after the explosions, police brought Kerr in for an official interview, and they found it to be a very unproductive interview because in that interview, Kerr resorted to claiming attorney-client privilege for every single question investigators asked him. He claimed to represent every single member of the Benson family, Margaret, Scott, Carol Lynn, and Stephen, and therefore any conversations or knowledge he had, any knowledge he had of financial issues, any potential motive he might have been able to uncover was protected.
He threw him into a deep pit of lawyer games.
So it's an interesting move, but it's not one I can completely fault him for. I mean, he is an attorney, and he knows how the police operate. He knows how dangerous it can be for somebody to talk to police without an attorney, but claiming attorney-client privilege over the interests of dead people really rubbed police the wrong way.
It's like the frog and the scorpion. He can't help it, he's a lawyer.
Yeah. And the press, they went nuts with this. But that's actually not what catapulted Kerr into the top of the suspect list. No, Kerr did something that will just drop your jaw. Are you ready? It all started with a man named, and I hope I'm saying this right, Guyon Deloach. It's spelled Guion, and it could be pronounced Guyon. I got like a gajillion different pronunciations from the Google box. Now, Deloach, we're going to call him mostly that because I don't know how to pronounce his first name. Deloach was a Naples attorney, and he was not a big, high-powered, expensive Naples attorney. He was a common man's lawyer. In January of 1985, Deloach had been visited by a woman wanting to have her will rewritten. She wanted as simple of a will as could be drawn up to equally divide her estate between her 3 children in the event of her death. No executor, no trusts, no frills, no high legal fees. Deloach did as asked, and the will was signed and witnessed and filed away. Now, Deloach thought nothing more about this until July 1985, when he turned on the news and saw the face of the woman he'd helped plastered all over as the victim of a vicious car bombing. The unassuming woman that had come to his office with her friend to have her will rewritten was none other than Margaret Benson.
Oh.
Now remember, we had discussed that Margaret had hired Kerr because she was angry at lawyers' fees that had added up so significantly in the process of settling her deceased husband's estate. So apparently, Margaret had expressed this frustration to one of her friends in Naples and asked if they knew a decent attorney that could draw up the simplest of wills for her. This friend happened to work in the same area as Deloach's office, and she accompanied Margaret to his office, and she signed the will as witness. Now, when they had shown up, Deloach had tried to ask some questions of Margaret in the interest of, representing her best legal options as his client. So he wanted to know if there were any minor children. He'd wanted to know if there were any grandchildren. He tried to talk to her about the possibility of setting up a trust. But Margaret reportedly told him, "Look, all I want is a simple will, equally dividing my estate 3 ways among my children, and I'm not going to answer any of your questions because it's none of your business." So Deloach complied with her requests. He drew up a 1-page will, charged her $75, and then filed it away.
Wow.
Now, Deloach knew, upon finding out that his client had been recently deceased, that he needed to reach out to their family, but he assumed that everyone was going to be grieving, and so he was going to give them a few days and then contact the family and let them know that he had her will. And then he heads to the probate court on a completely unrelated matter. But the Benson car bombing is huge news in Naples. So when he gets to the court, a clerk tells him, this is the day after the bombing, and a clerk tells him, somebody has already filed a Benson family will.
That wasn't the thing that he made.
Wasn't his will. And he notifies the clerk, I have a will for Margaret Benson. So on July 11th, 2 days after the bombing, an attorney claiming to represent Wayne Kerr, who in turn represents the entire Benson family, calls Deloach and is like, what do you mean you have Margaret Benson's will? And he was confident that this was some sort of scam. This couldn't be real. And he says, look, I have Margaret Benson's last will and testament, and it's dated May 23rd, 1983, so it's only 2 years old. I'm sure it supersedes whatever you have. And I would love to have seen what Wayne Kerr's face looked like when Deloach advised them that the will he had was dated January 29th, 1985, just 5 months and some weeks before the explosion. The press went wild. Kerr probably went pale. So now his cash cow of a client is dead, and this new will changes everything for him. Under the previous will, Wayne Kerr was the executor of the estate and was designated as the trustee, which would have netted him some really significant income in the form of legal fees. It's estimated that he stood to make somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 serving in those roles. And this new will was a massive financial loss for Kerr. So Kerr went to Deloach's office along with Stephen Benson, where the entire meeting reportedly made Kerr so exceptionally agitated and he was sweating and profusely to the point that Stephen Benson, who just lost his mother and brother and his sister severely injured, had to actually calm Kerr down and soothe him and tell him to just calm down. Everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to work out. But Kerr did not intend to back down without a fight. He intended to tie the wills up in court until a judge could determine if the new will was valid and would actually supersede the one that he had filed. He claimed that the signature on the new will didn't look like Margaret's, but it was. It was Margaret's. Also, the day that Kerr filed his version of the Benson will, he had also made the move of filing a declaration of domicile. Now, this is because in order to serve as the executor of Margaret's estate, he would have had to be a Florida resident. So when he filed the will, he also filed a declaration of domicile claiming that he had relocated to Florida 4 days before he filed the will, and the address he used was the address of the Meridian Security Office that Stephen and Margaret Benson owned and where Stephen worked. So Kerr's highly agitated behavior and the fact that he had filed the will so quickly and that he had lost out on such significant money because of this new will that existed, that made everyone really suspicious. And not so much that Kerr might have been the mastermind behind everything, but that he might have been in cahoots with Stephen and perhaps was involved.
Now it could be a conspiracy.
Now it could be a conspiracy. And I mean, the press went wild. The murdered tobacco heiress had a secret will. But wait, there's more. Kerr files his will in probate court a day after the murders and then files his declaration of domicile. And then he finds out about the new will. He gets all upset. And then on July 24th, he's interviewed by police. And this is where he claims attorney-client privilege and doesn't answer any questions. And then 2 days later, on July 26th, Kerr walks into the Naples office of Dean Witter Reynolds and attempts to withdraw $1 million cash and securities from Margaret Benson's active accounts. I presume, as her attorney, he had power of attorney, but it's my understanding that power of attorney ceases upon somebody's demise, which would have made this an illegal action, potentially.
I don't know about all that, but did he really expect that they would have $1 million?
Oh, he did. And the thing is that the people at Dean Witter, Kerr has never been into this office with Margaret, so they don't know him. But they do know from the press that there's controversy over the wills, and so the head of the office calls the probate court and is like, should I actually release these funds? And they were unequivocally like, no, do not release the funds.
No.
So then the question was Kerr acting on his client Steve Benson's behest? Or was this some sort of completely inexplicable harebrained scheme by Kerr to try to get some cash and flee before the legality of the second will could be decided? And we just don't know.
Last second buzzer shot.
Yeah. I was pretty stunned to find out that there didn't seem to be much further investigation about this at all. Investigators were so tied up talking to Stephen's old friends in Pennsylvania at this point, and they were also talking to Carol Lynn and getting her official statements, and everything that they said was so compelling that everyone seems to have forgotten that Kerr attempted to withdraw $1 million and do what with, we don't know. And Kerr would refuse to answer any questions citing attorney-client privilege until a judge would compel him to talk by ruling that privilege does not endure past a client's death. But once investigators were able to compel Kerr to answer their questions, they learned a lot more about Margaret Benson's finances, and it turns out Margaret had made a shocking discovery that affected her finances the day before the murders. And as a result of those discoveries, Margaret had been not just furious, but was actually considering making some really drastic financial changes that would have affected her children. Unfortunately, this order by the courts to compel Kerr to answer questions would not come until September 3rd, nearly 2 months after the murders. Meanwhile, investigators were starting to piece together the physical evidence that they hoped would close the case and send the responsible party to jail. Now, as I mentioned before, investigators excavated the area around the Suburban to a depth of 3 inches. They sifted it all and got rid of anything that was soil or plant matter and analyzed everything. And then each item was tagged and cataloged and painstakingly ruled out as a piece of the Suburban, leaving behind just items that were in the Suburban and pieces of the bombs. Investigators actually found the center section of some pipe end caps. And I've learned that these are called waffles. So like when you have a pipe end cap, you've got like the lip that's threaded, and then you've got the part on the end. That's called a waffle.
I did not know that.
I didn't either. And these waffles that they found, 3 of them, they found enough of to determine that they had a manufacturer imprint on them. So they had 3 identifiable pieces of end cap, and 2 of them were stamped with a U, indicating that they were made by a company called Union, and the 3rd was stamped by Grinnell. So this isn't much to go on. And investigators started the very slow process of calling around to all the hardware stores in Florida between Naples and Fort Myers, hoping that someone would recall someone purchasing some 1-foot sections of 4-inch piping and or the end caps in question.
That's a pretty long shot.
And unlike the ridiculous Thomas Schelling story of seeing Stephen carrying some copper tubes, this time investigators did hit pay dirt. You see, the hardware store they called, one of the hardware stores they called hundreds of them, was called Hughes Supply, and investigators were shocked to find out that they recalled receiving a phone call sometime around July 5th asking if they had 4 4-inch diameter end caps in stock. However, the store had told the gentleman that they only had 2 in stock. The 2 they had in stock happened to be 4-inch Union brand end caps, just like the ones investigators found pieces of.
That's amazing that they got feedback on that.
The gentleman that had come in and purchased the 2 had signed the receipt Del Rey Construction with an illegible name. And that's not all. They also had a different employee that had made a separate sale around the same time of 2 4-inch diameter, 12-inch lengths of pipe. And here's the icing on the cake. Hughes Supply is right down the street from Meridian Security, the company that Stephen Benson owned with his mother, and the building that Wayne Kerr had used to claim Florida domicile, and the place that Stephen worked every single day. It almost seems too perfect. But what about those Grinnell end caps? Because they only have the 2 Union ones that they can suspect that he may have purchased. Well, investigators were never able to find out where they had been purchased. But it did not escape their attention that one of Grinnell's manufacturing facilities was located right outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where Stephen had once purchased an entire remaining stock of a hardware store that was going out of business, including all their piping and other stuff that was stored in the family warehouse. So it is feasible that Stephen could have had these Grinnell end caps like in his garage or something that ended up moving to Florida with him. And I know it sounds like a stretch, until you learn that the type of stamp that Grinnell had used on the particular end cap they had found hadn't been used by Grinnell in over 8 years. So this end cap had to have been significantly older than the 2 Union brand end caps.
That's pretty compelling.
So investigators, they find out that the people at Hughes remember these purchases. They run down there to talk to the clerks that made the sales. Now, the first clerk, he remembered the sale, because this was my question, like, how would they remember such a mundane sale?
And where did employee retention go? Like, these people are all still there.
Well, yeah, this is like just weeks after.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, the employees remembered the sale because Hughes Supply typically supplies contractors for construction companies. So an order for 2 end caps was completely out of the ordinary for them, and that's what prompted them to recall it. However, the clerk that had sold the sections of pipe had zero recollection about the looks of the man that had bought them, but his colleague that had sold the 2 end caps, he did recall the man, and he was able to give police a description. The man was wearing a baseball cap and had on round, quote, John Lennon, unquote, style dark glasses. Inside, He was wearing sunglasses inside, which totally doesn't make you seem weird or stand out at all. When police showed both clerks a photo lineup that included Stephen Benson's picture, neither clerk could identify Stephen Benson as the person that had made the purchase. But they were showing the clerks a picture of Stephen Benson, no hat, just his regular everyday glasses that he needs to see, not sunglasses or John Lennon style glasses. So investigators had the clerk that said he could remember the guy work with a sketch artist. Now, this was a little confusing to me, but as I understand it, when they work with a sketch artist, the sketch artist has like all of these different pictures of different elements of a face. And you sort of pick out the pieces that match, and then from that they can sort of draw a composite. Well, they didn't have any eyes covered with John Lennon style sunglasses in the kit that they used. So it just so happens that they drew this very nondescript looking guy with a hat on, which literally could be just about anybody. And they filled in glasses. They just happened to pick glasses that were the size and shape of Stephen Benson's glasses, which made this mugshot look a lot like Stephen Benson.
Oh.
However, the pay dirt that the police were able to find was that the company was able to locate both sales receipts, and both receipts had a palm print on them. They said this is the kind of palm print, they called it a writer's palm print, that would occur if you like lay your hand on a piece of paper to hold it down while you sign it. And so now all investigators would need is a sample of Stephen Benson's palm print to compare to make a match. But there's a problem. Stephen Benson had never been fingerprinted in any sort of official capacity. He'd never joined the military, he'd never been arrested, he'd never applied for a security clearance, or any of the other myriad of reasons you might need to be fingerprinted. So his prints were not in any law enforcement databases for comparison. So investigators began hunting for his fingerprints and palm prints. Now remember their trip out to the Galleon Queen where they heard Paul Harvey, the captain's concerns that perhaps the yacht was wired to explode?
That was the rest of the story.
Right. They also heard about Scott's potentially ripping somebody off, and they didn't really seem interested in these stories or in searching the yacht for explosives. But do you know what they were interested in during that trip out there? Hunting through the entire yacht, looking for anything that might have Stephen Benson's fingerprints on it, because this was right after they had discovered the receipts. They came up empty-handed. They actually went through the Benson's trash and also came up empty-handed. So they asked...
Because there was no trash?
No, I don't... Maybe he wipes off his trash. Maybe he doesn't touch trash. I don't know. So they asked Stephen through his lawyer to submit his finger and handprints to exclude him as a suspect, which was not really their intention. They wanted to prove that he had purchased these things. And, of course, Stephen and his lawyer are too smart for this, and they said, nah.
No.
Yeah, they said no. So investigators did something that had never been done before. They applied for a first-of-its-kind search warrant. Only instead of searching property, this warrant required the subject to submit themselves for finger and palm printing.
That was the first time that was done?
First time.
Oh, wow.
And if it was successful, this, like I said, would have been the first time that a search warrant compelled a person to submit a part of their body to be searched, basically.
Well, like now we do. Now they do, like, warrants for DNA and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that back then they didn't have DNA. They didn't know what DNA was.
We don't really do DNA much. But they were going to need to present some really compelling reasons for requesting such a never-done-before search warrant. And remember, they have zero physical evidence except these receipts. So they were desperate to talk to anyone that could give them compelling enough reasons to convince a judge to force Stephen to submit his finger and palm prints. Enter Carol Lynn Benson Kendall. Investigators have been anxiously awaiting the opportunity to get Carol Lynn's formal statements after the bombing. The problem was that not only was she recovering from severe injuries in the hospital, but she wasn't in Florida any longer. Just days after the bombings, Wayne Kerr had arranged for her to be flown on a medical transport to Boston so she could be treated at a larger hospital and also be close to her 2 sons during her recovery. Now, it's interesting to note that soon after she was transferred to Massachusetts, Stephen Benson did reportedly travel to Boston to visit her, and they apparently had one very short, brief, awkward visit at the hospital. And after that...
Why was it awkward? Were they standing too close to each other?
I don't know. It's just everyone said that, like... I mean, Stephen was awkward anyway, so is it weird that he was awkward? Like, I don't know that that was weird.
Oh, okay. It's just default.
Yeah. But after that, Carol Lynn stopped accepting his phone calls, told him he was told not to come to visit her anymore, and she wouldn't even accept flowers that he'd sent her. So he was calling Carol Lynn's son regularly to get the condition of his sister, and Carol Lynn's son finally told him, look, I'm not allowed to talk to you anymore.
Well.
So before we get into the investigators' interviews of Carol Lynn, I just want you to remember something about Carol Lynn. She was a beauty queen. She was in the drama club. She wanted to be an actress. She was currently in a graduate program studying communications. Everyone that ever knew her thought she was charming, charismatic, persuasive, clever, and she'd grown up with exceptionally manipulative parents, which might make one think that perhaps she had also learned to be manipulative. Not saying she was, not accusing, just putting out there information that we've uncovered about her. And so we're going to keep that in mind as we get into this interview. So investigators have been chomping at the bit for weeks to talk to her, but she's severely injured, and her doctors are really concerned about her getting overtired and slowing down her recovery. In addition, at this point, Carol Lynn has hired an attorney of her own, a man named Richard, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. I think it's Sirace or Cirace. C-I-R-A-C-E.
That sounds like sauce.
Yeah.
And his first name is Richard.
Oh my God.
What? I was just saying his name is Dick Sauce.
Right. Yep. That's his name. Anyway, they did arrange for investigators to interview Carol Lynn in the presence of her attorney at Mass General, where she was in the intensive care unit, but with stipulations. She could only be interviewed for very short periods of time and then would need to have a very long break before resuming again to ensure that she got plenty of rest. So the agreement was a 15-minute interview every other hour.
Well, you don't want to take in too much spicy dick sauce at once.
Oh my God.
You got to spread it out over time.
Okay.
You got to become accustomed to the dick sauce. You can't just gulp it all down at once. You got to kind of sample it and get used to it.
Well, apparently Carol Lynn liked it because they frequently exceeded this time limit because Carol Lynn wanted to continue. But before they even started, investigators said they showed up and Carol Lynn was crying. And when the investigators were asked her why she was crying, she said that she knew that her cooperation was going to hurt her brother. Now, I'm not going to go into Carol Lynn's entire statement because it's really long, but we're going to hit a few highlights that are important. So she told investigators that it had been Stephen's idea specifically to go to her mother's lot that fateful day and stake out the new house. So Margaret and Wayne Kerr, remember they had been at the Meridian Security Office on July 8th, and Stephen had dinner plans, so they went back to Naples. And when they went back to Naples, they actually took Carol Lynn out for dinner because July 8th was Carol Lynn's 41st birthday. And after they returned to the house that night, the phone rings and Carol Lynn answers it, and it's Stephen. And he tells Carol Lynn, hey, I'm going to be there at 7:30 tomorrow morning to bring the books over for, Wayne Kerr. So you, Mom, Scott, and me, we're all going to go stake out the house first, and then I'll sit down and work with Wayne Kerr on it. And Carol Lynn specified to investigators that she thought this was odd, that he would, number one, insist Scott would go because this was not the kind of thing Scott would normally participate in, and number two, that he actually called to make such plans because she asserted that this was not the kind of thing that Stephen would have typically enjoyed doing or taken the lead on organizing. Also of note, she told investigators in her statement that she had noted that Scott was already in the driver's seat when she came out of the house to get in the car. But in her earlier statement to police when she was in the hospital in Naples, she told officers that Scott wasn't in the car yet, and she'd actually said to him to get in the car on her way to her seat. Now, I don't know if this discrepancy really matters. Whether he was in the car or out of the car, we knew he was getting in the driver's side, and I think that the important point was that she felt like this was an odd arrangement because normally Scott wouldn't drive, Stephen would. She told investigators that after the explosion, she saw Scott's body on the ground, and she'd gotten out of the car and was rolling around to extinguish her clothes, which were still burning. And she says then she looked up, she saw Stephen standing near the front of the Suburban. He was looking shocked and stunned, and he meets her eyes, and she sees his mouth moving and to form the words, "Oh my God." And then she says he doesn't come over to help her, and she doesn't understand why he doesn't come over to help her. Instead, he turns and runs into the house. Now, this is interesting. Sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I might be calling 911. I was going to ask, is 911 a thing in 1980?
Yeah, remember when he ran in the house, he yelled to call 911.
Okay.
So this is where he ran into the house to tell Wayne Kerr to call 911. But it's interesting because she can supposedly remember exactly where Stephen was standing, the look on his face, her feelings, but she can't remember. In her first interview after the explosion, she told investigators that she did not remember the second explosion. And in this interview, where she supposedly does remember the second explosion now, she says that it was 4 or 5 minutes after the first, which is not true. It was only a minute, but okay, trauma can screw up your time perception, so I'll give her that one. But she also has no recollection of the golfer that came over to help her, even though when the second bomb exploded, he fell on top of her. So she can supposedly remember the second bomb, but doesn't remember somebody fell on top of her, and she can supposedly now remember Stephen and his mouth moving and where he's standing and all that.
Well, those kinds of memories are hard to navigate.
I agree, and I'm not sure. I don't think she intentionally misleads anybody. I really don't. But I do think there's a lot of confusion in her memories. And to me, that's going to make her an unreliable witness on the witness stand.
Yeah, maybe.
Now, investigators are really curious about this, where Stephen runs back into the house instead of going to help Carol Lynn, as Carol Lynn supposedly remembers. Now, we know this is when Stephen ran in to tell Wayne Kerr to call 911. But investigators are wondering, because only one bomb went off at first, and the second bomb hadn't gone off yet when this happened, investigators believe that Stephen ran back into the house instead of running over to assist his sister because he knew there was a second bomb in the car that would go off, and he was trying to place distance between himself and the car.
So you think maybe the first one went off earlier than he expected?
I think they were both supposed to go off together, and I think it was actually the heat of the fire after the first bomb that actually triggered the second bomb. I think the second bomb failed. That's my theory.
Well, wasn't he like in the path of all that shrapnel and junk? Like, he's right there, right? She can see him, so...
Well, one of the things that we had discussed in an earlier episode is that he was standing in front of the Suburban, or walking away from it.
Right.
So the engine block was there. And when we look at the shrapnel damage to the house, there's not shrapnel damage in front of the car. So it does seem feasible that the engine block did shield a large area where Stephen could have been protected.
I forgot we talked about that.
Yeah, there's a lot here, so... All right, now during these interviews at Mass General, investigators had already heard rumors that Carol Lynn was actually Scott's biological mother, but at this point, they had not confirmed this. So during these interviews, investigators pull aside Carol Lynn's attorney after one of their sessions and are like, look, we suspect your client's not being 100% truthful, and if she is actually Scott's birth mother and she doesn't admit to it, nothing else she says is going to be considered credible if it's found out that she's lied to us about this, because we won't be able to put her on the stand, the press will have a field day, and the defense will shred her. So you need to convince your attorney that if she is actually Scott's birth mother, that she has to be truthful. And that's what she did. She told investigators about Scott's parentage, and she did admit that he was her son, and according to her, this was the first time in her life she had spoken the words out loud to tell anyone that she was Scott's mother. However, old habits die hard, and she actually continues to refer to him as her brother through the entire rest of the interview. She told investigators also that Margaret was very fearful of Scott, and she specifically cited that in Margaret and Scott's trip to Europe that occurred a few weeks before the bombing, Margaret had told Carol Lynn on the phone that she was afraid of Scott because his violent temper was escalating. But investigators, they didn't seem really interested in pursuing this line of questioning because, well, Scott's dead. And the truth is that they had already put their crosshairs on Stephen Benson, and going down this path of Scott being violent, that didn't support their theory. So they just sort of left it lying in the questioning. Reading through the transcripts, they really just try to pull her away from that line of thought.
They singing for the supper.
Yeah. Now, it's also easy. I want to give investigators a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. It gets easy to identify bias after the fact, but in the moment, sometimes it's hard to identify your own bias.
Yeah, I could never do that. I'm not suggesting I could do their job or anything.
No, I couldn't either.
No.
Now, investigators asked Carol Lynn about who might have wanted to harm the Bensons. And remember that she had told the maid the day of the bombings that Kim Beagle's brothers had murdered her brother and her mother. She mentioned nothing about Kim Beagle's brothers in this interrogation, or in this interview. She didn't mention that her own ex-husband, Tom Kendall, had in the past threatened to kill her. She squarely points fingers at one person when asked who hated the Bensons. And that one person was Deborah Benson, Stephen's wife. And if the reports of the things we've talked about Debbie doing, taking the kids away and withholding them from Stephen, then she's not a very likable person, possibly in general. But what Carol Lynn accused her of in her official statement is just absolutely unhinged. She starts on the topic of Debbie with what Michael Mushaw described in his book as a splenetic outburst of accusations. And I love the word splenetic.
I was going to say that's going to be the word of the day.
Splenetic.
Splenetic.
And she said that Debbie was evil. Debbie has no scruples. Debbie has no morals. She accused Debbie of, quote, trying to beat up my poor little mother for no reason. And then she dropped the really unhinged part. She said that she believed Debbie was slowly poisoning Stephen, as evidenced by the fact that Stephen was frequently ill, which totally couldn't have at all been from the insane stress he was probably under between having a manipulative wife and an equally manipulative mother. But whatever.
If she knew that, she wasn't slowly doing nothing about it.
And her theory was that Debbie was trying to keep Stephen ill so that once their grandfather, Harry Hitchcock, died and Stephen inherited his portion of Harry's fortune, then she could just easily finish him off with the rest of the poison. And, the poor frail bastard dies. And if that's not unhinged enough, buckle up, Buttercup, because I've got a direct quote for you. Are you ready?
I'm going to hold on to something again.
Okay. This is from Carol Lynn. Quote, Debbie wasn't well educated, but she was street smart and very conniving and sneaky. And it wouldn't have been something that she would not have been capable of figuring out how to do or even to acquire some kind of poison. It could have even been some herbal medicine from the woods in Wisconsin, because they really lived in the backwoods. I mean, they grew up with 14 children in a house with no plumbing. So I think they used a lot of, herbal things. So it wasn't something that was out of the question.
Oh my God! It could have been grass poisoning. Someone could have touched the grass.
And no one brought in a psychiatrist or a therapist at this point.
I feel like I need one.
She also told investigators that when Debbie had taken the kids to Wisconsin and finally let Stephen come and visit them, that during one of his visits, he actually ended up in intensive care. He was so sick. And it was that trip, before he ended up with intensive care, that Stephen had met with a divorce attorney in Wisconsin. Then Stephen ends up in ICU, and while he's in the hospital, she said Debbie snuck in, stole his briefcase, jimmied the locks, and took all the papers that were pertinent to their potential divorce and to him trying to have some custody of his children. And, yeah, but it didn't matter because then Debbie abruptly changed her mind about the divorce and came back to Florida. And Carol Lynn said this is because Harry Hitchcock had suddenly been diagnosed with some sort of potential serious health issue, and Carol Lynn thought Debbie thought that Stephen was about to inherit more money, so why divorce the guy before he gets richer?
Oh, that's not convenient.
And then she went on to tell investigators that she was pretty sure that this third child that Debbie and Stephen had wasn't even Stephen's baby.
Oh.
And then she pulled out the really big guns against Debbie. She told investigators, and get ready to grasp your pearls, that Stephen had to do all his own laundry and do house cleaning and everything around the house to help, even though he, collective gasp, worked all day.
What?
Now, remember that Carol Lynn had at one point had a break-in at her house in which she had to admit to police that her house had not actually been ransacked. This was her normal housekeeping style. And yet she's turning and looking at Debbie and saying she's a terrible person because she doesn't do 100% of the housekeeping or 100% of the laundry. Not even that she keeps a bad house or doesn't keep it clean, just that she makes Stephen do anything around the house. Now, Carol Lynn's entire statement to police was, of course, transcribed, and it's 136 pages, and 34 pages of it, which is 25% of it, a quarter of it, is all her ranting about Debbie. The things that Debbie said about the family, how she was raising her kids to hate the Bensons, how she'd gotten physical with different family members during arguments, and of course how she was probably slowly poisoning Stephen as some sort of criminal mastermind looking to make off with his inheritance like a Black Widow, and I don't know, it's all a bridge too far for me.
What a horrible cow.
Why did investigators allow Carol Lynn to go off on such a long tangent about Debbie when they weren't interested in her statements about Scott's increasingly violent temper or didn't question her at all about his shady friends? And we don't know, but I have a theory that investigators may have suspected that Debbie actually put Stephen up to the murders, and they have this mounting pressure to get this first of its kind search warrant. And so that's my suspicion, unfounded, unprovable, but that's what I think. And so I gotta say, if that's the case, way to be unbiased, fellas.
That's not a bad theory.
But it's what Carol Lynn said about Stephen's finances and his business that really caught the attention of investigators. However, they can't just go off hearsay. They needed to talk to Wayne Kerr, who was still claiming attorney-client privilege, and until a judge would compel him to talk, they could not confirm what Carol Lynn told them that Margaret knew and had discovered about her finances. But before we get to what Wayne Kerr does eventually tell investigators, I want to put this out there. As is probably totally typical after questioning a victim of a crime and someone that police claim was a suspect in said crime when initially interviewed. Police, they did their days-long interview with her, and then they went out and got her a card and a gift, and they were so close with Carol Lynn afterwards that she actually referred to them in public interviews as her knights in shining armor. Totally normal treatment of a witness by police. Totally normal.
They're playing that lady.
Now, that's not all that left me a little bit sketched out about the police interview of Carol Lynn. You see, 100% of the interviews were taped. Or were they?
What do you mean?
Well, they were supposed to talk for 15 minutes every 2 hours, but there's multiple places during the discussion where Carol Lynn's attorney, you can hear on the tape, asks them to go off the record for a moment. The recording is stopped. Presumably there's some discussion happening, and then the recording continues. This really opens up the possibility that Carol Lynn was being heavily coached by her attorney, which is not unusual. Your attorney has a right to do that when you're being questioned.
Nor is it weird or wrong
It's not.
Or anything. That's fine.
But the police did not say that they left the room to let the attorney and Carol Lynn speak. So the way that the transcript reads and the way that the recordings happened, it sounds like there's a strong possibility that police were helping to coach Carol Lynn through the interview. I don't know that that's the case.
That would be unethical.
But it reeks of suspicious. So, Now, this is my interpretation based on how it sounds. I'm not saying that the police did anything unethical. But there was times where they asked questions, were asked to go off the record, turn off the tape. They turn the tape back on, and then they ask a different question, or they reword the question, which seems to me that they were corroborating with the attorney.
You got some kind of editing privileges over there.
Yeah, I don't feel like that's very kosher. And even more jaw-dropping, one of the two investigators admitted in an interview later that they had been so charmed by Carol Lynn and her charisma and her damsel in distressedness that he said he felt a little bit like they were being seduced by her through the process. And they just couldn't help but really like her and, you know, feel some kind of way toward her.
Oh, it's a two-way street.
Dude, WTF. Why would you ever admit that in a public interview? Hi, I'm incapable of doing my job without bias and fairly.
I'm glad they were honest.
It makes for a better podcast. Thank you, police. Interestingly, police never asked Carol Lynn about her sons, as one might logically presume both of them would have a potential financial motive for the crime. And in fact, shortly after Carol Lynn was released from the hospital, she had a verbal altercation with one of her sons because he asked her for money because he wanted to go out and live large on the town for the night. And when she told him no, he physically attacked her, knocked her down, stole the money, and left.
Oh.
And Carol Lynn's attorney did confirm that this incident happened, but police, they weren't interested in anyone that wasn't named Stephen, apparently. Now, my biggest issue with these interviews is that even when Carol Lynn brought up potential people that might have had an issue with the family, police did not delve into questioning her about those relationships at all. They were focused on Stephen Benson and his wife and their particular motives. And the way they questioned her, focusing so much on Stephen, it just felt really leading to me in reading the transcripts.
You mean Stephen did it, right? Like, they're talking to you. Like, hey, what happened that night?
Yeah, it's felt that way.
You went to 7-Eleven, but Stephen did it, right?
Yeah,
Right.
It seemed to lean that way hard. Now, there's one tidbit in Carol Lynn's statement that absolutely interested police. Carol Lynn told investigators that Margaret was considering making drastic changes to how she managed her money because she believed that Stephen had been embezzling money from her. She even explained that the real reason for Wayne Kerr's trip to Florida was to investigate these troubling allegations that Margaret made against Stephen and to find out what her options were to punish her son if they turned out to be true. But this is all hearsay, and investigators need to talk to somebody with direct knowledge of Margaret's suspicions and find out what Margaret's financial situation was and what she might have known. And that person that would have that information is Wayne Kerr. Again, he is claiming attorney-client privilege, refusing to answer questions, but on September 3rd, a judge ruled that Kerr could not claim privilege for deceased persons, and he would have to answer the investigators' questions regarding Margaret and Scott. But any private discussions that he had had with Stephen would be allowed to continue to be protected under attorney-client privilege. So once he had to cooperate with investigators, Kerr confirmed that there was absolutely some major bombshells that Margaret had just uncovered the day before the murders. And we're going to get into that on the next episode.
What?
I told you, there's a lot to this case. It's twisty and turny, and
You're going to finish it up on the next one?
I think it's going to be 7 when we're done.
Sure.
But people like multi-part episodes.
Well, I know,
They
that's what I
like the
was
deep
thinking.
dive.
They would.
I mean, basically, I saved people from reading 2 books and 2,000 pages of court transcripts by picking out all the juicy bits.
Because they were definitely going to do that.
Some people might. I did. But, like, I think about podcasts, like, that have done really, really deep dives that have really intrigued me. And that's what I've been trying to do. Is I've been trying... there's a lot... there's a lot more we could go into. Even some of it that might have, like, some potential bearing on your feelings about the case. But I just took the, like... I tried to take just the peanuts out and not...
A little 7-hour skim.
Yeah.
No big deal.
No big deal. But if you just read, like, if you just read press on this case, you're going to get so far misled because every little rumor, true or not, made it into the papers and then got so exaggerated and blown out of proportion that you can't really trust a lot of what the newspapers reported before the trial started. Once the trial started, then they could report on true things that happened in the trial, but all the press that came before the trial is suspect. And I've seen televised documentaries by major news organizations that got facts wrong, that were absolutely directly refuted in the court documents. All they had to do is read them.
That's not that surprising. They do that all the time.
And I'm not saying that I got every single detail 100% right, because I did have to do a little bit of extrapolation here and there, where I had two different versions of events, because one book is told with Carol Lynn's cooperation and one is not. But I did my best to corroborate everything that I put in here.
Well, you've done a lot of good. You've done a lot of work.
I have. And I have a lot more work to do because now I have to edit this. The dog finally settled down. He always settles down right about the time we're done.
Yeah.
Something about me telling the story just soothes him right to sleep.
It's a good sleepy time. Scary story.
A sleepy time.
Weirdness and despair.
I like listening to true crime stories to fall asleep, so I get it. I get it, dog. I get it.
He said that's right, G.
All right. I never know how to end these. I thought I came up with a clever ending the other day, and then I forgot what it was.
I got one for you.
Okay, what?
Show's over.
There you go. Show's over. The investigation after the dog ruins Benjamin. Please consider leaving us a positive... Dog? Please consider leaving us a muzzle. Please consider leaving us a positive review of this... Seriously, dog. What?
It's the song of his people.
Go to sleep, dog. Mommy and Daddy have to record a podcast. Lay down your head. Go to sleep. Shut the fuck up, my dear. The dog, not you.
Oh.
Why
is my tail between my legs?
I don't think we'll lose power. It hasn't flickered yet. Usually it gives us a warning. A warning flicker. Maybe we should just give him his own microphone.
Does he need one?
Clickety-clack, clickety-clack.
He's using mine pretty well, I think.
Go lay down, puppy dog. Or stand there and whine. Whatever. It sounds like he falls down the stairs when he goes down.
Wow.
Alright, now we just...
He's going to dry his face now.
Now he's going to dry his face. He's got to click around on the hardwood floors for a little bit. Click, 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 click. Hang on. I can't read my own writing. And it's typed, so that's pretty impressive. Now, investigation... Yeah.
Sometimes I don't know the strength of my own mouth. Grab something out of the fridge over here.
Okay. I'll allow it.
I got something in a jar.
What?
Just a jar.
A jar?
Jar.
Do you have like moonshine or something in there?
I don't even know what it is. Something like that.
Where did you get it?
Tennessee.
Oh. So.
Oh, why'd you say oh like that? Oh.
I don't
Tennessee.
know. That's just how I say oh.
Third world country, Tennessee.
I love Tennessee.
Hate Tennessee. I'm just saying words.
We've got the moonshine. That should pep up my co-host, Batman. Should pep up Batman. You know how I'm a lightweight.
Listen, lady. I don't have to give you this moonshine. But I'm going to do it anyway. You enjoy that.
Ooh, it does smell like apple pie. Oh, that's so good.
It's good, right? You yelled at a person. And it seemed like a dangerous place to be yelling at people.
God, this stuff is really good. Should not be legal.
It might not be. I'm not sure.
It might not be. Let's not admit that on the air.
Jeez Louise.
Now I've just totally lost my... Okay.
You just talked about your...
All right. Well, we're going to cut that out.
What? No more...
No, I mean out of the audio.
Oh. Balls. It's like a horrible dystopian future.